Good evening to all of you. This is my second visit to the South Madras Rotary grouping, and I remember last time Mr. Venkateshwaran had requested me to come and speak to the members here, and as they say, lightning never strikes the same place twice, but as with every rule, there is always an exception which proves the rule. So I think we may take it that lightning does occasionally strike the same place twice. So here I am before you. Let me give you of course it's a 20-minute presentation, but nevertheless, we can have some kind of a broad overview of what my presentation is going to be on. To begin with, I thought I will touch a bit on the political context of Modi's elevation to the position of the Prime Minister of India, for no other reason that politics is always fun to talk about, to discuss. So therefore, no discussion on economic issues confronting the government would really be complete without an underlying political context. As you would see in the course of my presentation, that there is a very, very compelling political dimension to Mr. Modi's election, and so we should therefore actually go into some aspects of that. And then we will move on to a brief look at the kind of issues that his government is confronted with. Certainly, we wouldn't really be going into all the facets of the challenge that he faces. Certainly, it's enough if we get a flavor of what kind of challenges that he faces. And then I would round it off with a certain social context to the economic challenges. Because, at the end of the day, I think economic growth is really not an end in itself. It is only a means to some desirable social outcomes. And as members of a social philanthropic organization like the Rotary Club, I think you probably would be really looking forward to some kind of a brief mention on the kind of social context in which the country is currently situated. So these are the three parts on which I would briefly look at this issue of the challenges facing the Modi government. The first thing that strikes everyone about Mr. Modi's election in the recently concluded general election is the element of surprise. I say this deliberately because, at least in the sections of the society, particularly the middle class and maybe the upper middle class and the entrepreneurial class, maybe there was a certain amount of expectation and perhaps even a certain fond wish that he would succeed in this election. But otherwise, I think a whole lot of them were rather skeptical about his chances. Certainly, pollsters never really gave him the kind of victory that he ended up achieving, with the exception perhaps of one pollster who had perhaps got it right. Today's Chanakya is a market research organization, and so apart from that, I think everyone were grossly off the mark, even though they might have given the NDA a comfortable majority. But I think most pollsters got it wrong. I think that's a fair observation. Journalists certainly did not get it right, and certainly the newspaper group to which I belong certainly was probably just as guilty of not reading the tea leaves as correctly as they should have. So therefore, there was, in fact, I would even go to the extent of saying that even the party, the BJP and the alliance partners themselves probably never really quite expected this kind of victory that happened. I think, I do recall the launch of Business Line's Ahmedabad edition about a year and a month ago, sometime in April, we had the launch function. And Mr. Modi, as the Chief Minister of Gujarat, was the chief guest of the function. So later in the evening, two of my colleagues did meet him for an off-the-record discussion with him. And while he did say that we will do very well, he never really sounded very confident about the prospects. In fact, so nervous he was about the outcome, he kept harping on how the Congress party would really unleash the Central Bureau of Investigation and other investigating agencies and to, thwart his progress to the top job in the country. So therefore, I suspect that even Mr. Modi himself probably, though might have sounded a bit optimistic in his interviews and conversations towards the later part of the campaign, I think he never really quite gave himself that kind of a chance as he ended up achieving in terms of election results. And again, much later, near about the last phase of polling, one of my business line colleagues did interview Mr. Amit Shah, and that was on record. But even there, he did say that he thought BJP would get about 230 or 240 seats, and the NDA alliance would probably get somewhere around 290, 300 kind of thing. But as we know, the numbers were considerably higher than that. So therefore, all this led to people thinking that, Modi sort of created some kind of a wave or a sort of an excitement, dazzled the public with his possibilities, and I think people bought into that story. So this was the perception. But I think this does a great disservice to the intelligence of the average voter. I think he's a very shrewd and smart person. In fact, if I may use a politically incorrect expression, I think the average voter has all the smartness and the calculating nature of a Gujarati Baniya businessman. And I think, so therefore, the notion that Modi somehow dazzled the public with his oratory, with his image of what all are possible should he get elected, etc., is, I think, not a complete story. Yes, there was a certain marketing success to his campaign, and certainly he did create some atmospherics around his campaign. Like the time in one of his campaign speeches, he spoke about, I think, a mother sending off her son in search of a job, and she's all the time nervous as while he gets into the station and then gets into the train, and she asks him, please don't get down from the train while in any intermediate station, don't get into the train while it is in motion. Then again at 9 o'clock in the night she says, son, have you had your dinner? The son keeps telling that, don't worry ma, I'm quite fine, and so on. And finally around 12 o'clock or so she calls him and says, are you okay, kind of thing. Then again he says that everything is fine. And then around 4 o'clock he says that yes, no, little after midnight he says that, look, I have now entered the borders of Gujarat, at which the mother is supposed to say, okay, now I can go to sleep at peace. Now, you see, these are the kind of, atmospherics or theatrical devices that he did use to create that image. But at the end of it all, I think the voter chose him rather than he sold himself to the voter. And I think there is a certain reason for that why we should believe that the voter is a very rational, cool, calculating individual, is that if you had asked him, for instance, in 2004, let's say if Sonia Gandhi were to present herself before an average voter and say that, look, I will give you a government for 10 years which will deliver a rate of growth in the economy that is 25% more than what the previous NDA government had achieved. Would you re-elect me in 2014? Now, common sense would say, on the face of it, that yes, the voter would say yes, if you can deliver a 25% better performance compared to the previous government and sustain it over 10 years, then surely you deserve another chance. That probably would have been the surface logic or a rationale to his answer. But as it happened, 2014 was not really what one would have expected in 2004 with this kind of framing of a question. So, to my mind, I think this represents a higher level of rationality behind the voter's behavior. Now, what is this superior rationality? Now, if you really look at the 2004 to 2014, you would find that the UPA government kept improving on economic performance year after year till it reached the year 2010-11, where it touched the growth rate of 9%. Then 2011-12 it dipped to 6%, and 2012-13 it dipped to 5%, and 2013-14 was closer to 4.5 to 4.9%. So what this really suggests is that it's not enough if you deliver an overall performance. It is essentially your current form that matters. Just like we say in cricket that a batsman is only as good as his latest string of scores rather than his overall average in batting. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule. For example, a Sachin Tendulkar might take his position in the team for granted, even if he had a string of failures leading up to the latest match. But that is not given to the likes of Sehwag or Gautam Gambhir. So in other words, if you have an iconic personality, if you have a charismatic leader, perhaps you can get away with an average performance which is superior to somebody else rather than your current form. But I think if you really look at the record of somebody like Mr. Manmohan Singh or Ms. Sonia Gandhi, I don't think anybody would seriously lay claim to an attribute that they are very charismatic, natural leaders. And so therefore they are subjected to the penalty of current form as opposed to an overall average record which might be superior. So to my mind, this again only goes to show that the average voter is really looking at what the immediate past performance of a particular ruling dispensation is, and on that basis makes a judgment rather than the overall record. And to expand on that, if you really look at the performance, I think what we really need to understand is that the economic growth per se is not very important, but it is the quality of that growth that is very important. What do I mean by quality of growth? I think there is a certain connect between the economic growth as measured in terms of GDP numbers and the growth as it manifests in terms of the well-offness of a large majority of the public. And this is where I think we need to link the GDP performance of a government with the kind of inflation numbers that sort of necessarily get associated with this GDP number. You must have read about the recent controversy, particularly in the Western press, about whether capitalism tends to accentuate inequality in the society or not. And a French economist by the name of Thomas Piketty had come up with a book which tends to argue that capitalism, by its very inherent characteristics, tend to accumulate wealth in the hands of the rich, and therefore it tends to accentuate the inequality in the society. And of course, the larger point he makes is that as long as the return on capital in a society, a capitalist society tends to generally reward capital far more than the reward for labor. So therefore there is a natural tendency towards concentration. While we need not go into this esoteric debate about does capitalism contribute to concentration of wealth and so on, I think this much we can certainly accept. While growth tends to generally sort of lift upwards to the upper sections of the society, inflation generally tends to sort of slide down to the bottom, which means inflation is more likely to affect a larger number of people at the lower strata of the society. And therefore, if you really want to be measured in terms of good governance, you not only need to take care of the growth, you should also, I think, look at how you fare in relation to this very, very critical parameter of inflation. And if you look at the record of achievement of the NDA government between 1999 to 2004, UPA won between 2004 to 2009 and UPA2, which is 2009 to 2014, a very remarkable aspect of their performance that comes to light, which prompts me to sort of advance a proposition, in fact something which I have sort of come up with in the course of thinking about what I should be talking on the subject in today's meeting, which I call as a factor of 2 between GDP and inflation. What is this factor of 2? This factor of 2, in my opinion, is that for whatever be the level of economic performance in terms of GDP, your inflation must be half, or in other words, your GDP must be twice the percentage of inflation that is there in the economy. Now, if you look at 1999-2004, BJP-led NDA government had, during its terms, inflation in the economy was of the order of about 4.2 or 4.3%, which is pretty good, I should say, in terms of inflation management. And it had a growth rate of 6%. So in other words, the differential between inflation and GDP was a factor of only 1.4. To my mind, or it would seem in retrospect, that the voters did not think that level of GDP performance in relation to the inflation that was there in the economy at that time was a good enough record of achievement, and so they voted NDA out of power. Now let's look at what happened in UPA 1. UPA 1 period, the inflation level was certainly much more elevated than it was during the NDA government. The 2004 to 2009 period saw an average inflation of about 6%. But the GDP growth during the same period was of the order of about 9%. I mean, it's a little less than 9, but close to 9. So in other words, the general public would seem to think that 1.5 times economic output performance relative to the level of inflation in the economy would seem to sort of, leave the general public slightly better off than they were in an earlier period. But if I were a betting man, I would say that 1.5 is a lot of cutting it too close. You really need to take it something higher, and therefore, for want of anything better, I settled on the figure 2, because 1, it's certainly higher than 1.5 and quite by some distance at that. And number 2 is a very nice whole integer, and therefore, if any government wants to be re-elected to power, it better deliver a GDP performance that is at least twice that of the level of inflation in the economy, so that a large number of people generally feel much better off than they were earlier. Now, if you think that sort of these 99-2004 and 2004-2009 doesn't really quite represent a valid hypothesis, I would urge you to look at what happened between 2009 and 2014. Now, we had 11% inflation during this period. It's an amazing record. But whereas during this period, the UPA2 government was able to deliver a growth of only about 6.5% on an average, though the last 3 years were very disappointing, but certainly the first 2 years were pretty good. So you see that 11% inflation would have necessarily demanded that the UPA2 government deliver a real output of something of the order of at least, say, 16 to 17% real output, not nominal output. Nominal output, actually, they did deliver 17%, but I'm talking about real output, because it is the real output which finally going to measure how well off the general public is. So therefore, if you look at all the 3 5-year terms, it seems to me that there is some kind of a connect between inflation and the growth in real output, and only when the real output is above a certain percentage of the inflation in the economy can a government hope to come back to power. And in UPA2's case, I think they sort of compounded their problem by not even seeming to care about governance. Everybody talks about the policy paralysis in the government in the last 2 years. And I think the scams that broke out in the initial year of the second term of the UPA, which sort of reached a crescendo in 2011, I think only confirmed in the public mind that these guys not only not care about governance, but I think they have a very bad attitude about governance and about the people. in fact, when numbers like 1,80,000 crores as a sum, that was the corruption amount involved in the allotment of spectrum for 2G telephony service. The point was not so much about whether it is a corruption of 1,80,000 crores or something like that. I mean, beyond a certain number, I don't think people have a conception about, how to really visualize these things. So therefore, the magnitude of the corruption, even if we have, some kind of a disagreement about the exact amount involved, was so large that I think people tended to believe that this ruling dispensation not only not care about governance, it actually doesn't even care about the public. I think, therefore, even if you do succeed in terms of delivering a level of output relative to the inflation in the economy, but I think you need to also get the atmospherics right. So therefore, Modi, I think what he really needs to do is that given a certain level of inflation, which is likely to prevail based on both internal conditions as well as external factors, must settle down on a certain growth rate that he has to somehow achieve. Otherwise, he is certainly not going to fancy his chances of re-election come 2019. Now, so what is the prospect at this moment? Today, the Reserve Bank of India had come out with its monetary policy statement, which is a twice a month feature. And what they are saying is that they expect the inflation in the economy during 2014-15 to be of the order of about 8%. And they also think that the economy would grow at around 5 to 6%. And if we take even the more optimistic estimate of 6%, so what we are really looking at is an 8% inflation and a 6% GDP growth. So by my hypothesis of the factor of 2, Modi government's first year is really not going to be a great year. But that said, I mean, it's good that elections are held only once in 5 years and not you're not called into account every year. So therefore, Modi does certainly have a certain breathing time to get things in order. Now, he has to do a few things right. Now, traditional economic theory holds that basically there are 3 tools available to a government which it can use in combination or any one of it to generate output growth. One is, of course, the structural factors in the economy. You try to focus on the structural factors like export competitiveness or inflation or capacity underutilization and so on. So these are the structural factors. Then you can also resort to some kind of fiscal stimulus, make the government spend a little more, and through that process try to bring about a higher level of economic output. And a third option that often and in fact it's being certainly practiced in the vast majority of countries in the West, is called the monetary loosening up. Make credit available at a very attractive rate, and in the process make people borrow and use it to spend, or make people borrow and use it to invest in some new capacity creation, and in the process the level of activity in the economy goes up. Now, if you look at India's situation, you would find that the option of monetary loosening is really not available to us, given the fact that we have a fairly elevated level of inflation in the economy. Now, why is inflation relevant in the context of cost of capital? Banks cannot lend at a cheaper rate unless the deposit rates are also brought down. Now, it will be very harsh on the saver to make him settle for a lower rate of interest that is even lower than the inflation in the economy. Then you are actually disincentivizing him for saving. So therefore, if your inflation is going to be 8%, the least that the banking system can offer to a saver is at least a 1 percentage point more than the level of inflation, which means you're looking at a deposit rate of 9%. If you want to give a 1% real rate of return for the guy who is going to scrimp and save on his expenses so that he can put that money in the bank. So therefore, if deposit rates are going to be 9% and above, there's just no way borrowers are going to get money at anything less than 12 or 13%. So, given the fact that inflation is still at 8%, at least the RBI thinks that for the next 6 months to 9 months or so, inflation is not going to come down to less than 8%. I don't really see how any policymaker in India can really look at monetary loosening as a means of stimulating demand and stimulating investment in the economy. So therefore that's ruled out. Fiscal stimulus. Now we did try this device in 2008, 2009 and 2010. Now fiscal stimulus is a bit like a sort of a steroid booster to enhance your performance. It will work only for a certain amount of time. And that is what it did in 2009 and 2010 when there was a global financial crisis and people were very concerned about how India will be able to cope with the overall slowdown in the economy. And therefore we did resort to fiscal stimulus. We sort of loosened up on borrowing expenditure, and if it meant even borrowing to finance the public expenditure, the government said, let's do it. And of course the popular programs like public, the right to food and right to employment and so on, all of that also contributed to a certain fiscal situation where we today have a public debt which is 80% of the GDP. And most economists believe that 80% is really the danger zone, unless of course you are an economy like the United States, when, in which case you can even go up to 100, 110. Or for that matter, a country like Japan, which has historically operated on very high levels of public debt relative to its GDP. So therefore, we don't have the luxury of fiscal stimulus too. So which means that we really need to focus on ensuring that the structural factors that are inhibiting the Indian economy from performing to its true potential is addressed. Now, one of the things that he really needs to do is that wherever there are capacities which are mothballed for a variety of reasons, now you have to find a way of trying to bring those capacities back on stream. For example, there has been so much talk about some 20,000 megawatts of power generating facilities that have not really been producing any electricity because there's natural gas in short supply. Now, yes, one way to do that would be to set up some liquefaction facilities in the East Coast and then see that these power plants are supplied with power. But the problem is that such gas is available at an average cost of something like $13 per million British thermal units, which tends to put the cost of electricity at 6 rupees and 7 rupees per unit, if not more. So the question is the consumer willing to pay 7 or 8 rupees per unit, or would the industrial user be willing to pay 7 rupees or 8 rupees per unit of power and still be able to sell the goods at a certain price which will leave him with a profit to make it all worthwhile? Now, this is a very hard question that doesn't lend itself to a very easy answer right away. But certainly there are many such sectors where one has to really address these kind of issues, that how are we going to get this 20,000 megawatts of gas-based power supply generating stations back on stream. The other kind of problem that this government is going to face is that there are conflicting objectives with regard to a certain investment decision. For instance, if you really need more output, that means you need to produce more electricity. If you need to produce more electricity, given the economics that exists at the moment, I think you willy-nilly have to consider coal-based thermal power stations as an option. Now, for some reason or other, nature chose to put coal beneath forests. Now, if you want to extract coal, you have to destroy the forest and maybe afforest it somewhere else at some later time and so on. But so here you have a clash of objectives. You want the green cover to be retained, but at the same time you want to extract coal out. And on top of it, tribals for some reason or other have chosen to live in forests. So if you really want to cut open the forest, you also have to ask the tribals to vacate and maybe move to some other place. Now that means you are sort of tampering with a certain style of a livelihood or a certain lifestyle that a tribal population is accustomed to, and growth would necessarily mean some kind of a dislocation to their style of living. So you have conflicting objectives, and how a government is going to be able to sort of mediate between the conflicting stakeholders to an investment project is another challenge that the government faces. It is not only electricity, but there is a broader ambit of energy security that India needs to look at, and which means we have to really reduce our dependence on crude petroleum resources which are currently imported from the Middle East. Now, here again, the problem is that we have a vast continental shelf that has not been explored, and if we have to explore, we need to really basically promise the explorer the freedom of global market determined prices. Now, unfortunately, in the dispute between the Ambani brothers, this very salutary principle had been compromised. As a matter of fact, it never occurred to anyone when the new exploration licensing program or policy was launched that an explorer, in case he strikes oil or gas, he is going to get anything other than a market-related price. In fact, 2007, when Reliance, after it had struck oil, and it was a matter of 2 years or 3 years before the gas would be brought on shore, they did bid for contracts to supply natural gas to power plants, and one of the power plants happened to be National Thermal Power Corporation, and they did bid to supply at $1.8 per million British thermal unit. Now, somewhere along the way, as a settlement was reached between the two brothers, and he had agreed to, I think, $1.8 per MBTU for the Anil Ambani's gas-based power station. At that time too, the international prices of gas was only in the region of about $2, so it seemed a good deal. But within about 6 months or so, as generally the global economy was heating up prior to the eventual meltdown in August 2008, gas prices had shot up to $4. Now, so Ambani had thought of this device of bringing in the camel into the oil market tent, which is the government, and in the process, I think he said, no, the government will set the gas price. And today the government finds itself very difficult to extricate itself. Now, common sense tells us that original government determined prices of $4.2 per MBTU should never really have been done. The government should have said, we are not getting involved in it. You find a buyer and sell it at whatever price. As long as the price is a fair price, is in line with whatever we think is a commercially viable price, we will not interfere. If they had done that, there would never really have been a problem. Today, even if the Modi government were to open up one more round of bidding for licenses, I think the first question that the Shells and the Exxon Mobil and all these oil majors are going to ask is, okay, so what have you decided about the dispute involving Reliance Industries? So therefore, the government has to take a call, even if it means that Mukesh Ambani's and the shareholders of Reliance Industries are going to benefit from a market determined prices. They will have no choice but to take the call, but it is not going to be a very easy decision for Modi's government to take, especially with Mr. Kejriwal having already sort of upped the ante in saying that, look, this is a government run by the big industrialists like the Ambanis and the Tatas and the Mundras and so on and so forth. Sorry, not Mundras, the Adanis and so on. So therefore, this is another issue. Energy security requires an international price for whatever that is extracted, and is the government going to have the political courage to be able to say yes to that? So this is another challenge that I think they are going to face. And on the third issue, I mean, something that has been, I think, talked about and something like that, the administrative apparatus in government has virtually collapsed, and nobody wants to take a decision. And with some very good reason, if you ask me. See, the system today penalizes a dynamic and a honest officer from taking what he believes to be a decision in larger public interest. Now, why this has come about is something we can debate, but the fact of the matter is this is there today. See, in 1986 it was 1986, yes, correct. I think Chidambaram was the Minister of State for Personnel and Administrative Reforms under Rajiv Gandhi's government, and that was the time when being clean was seen as the greatest badge of honor among the politicians, and so this law was passed, Prevention of Corruption Act. Now, per se, there was nothing wrong with it. I mean, there was one particular clause which really created a huge complication for the more honest officer. Now, what did it say? It says that if a decision results in benefit to a certain individual, and even if the person, the civil servant who's taken the decision himself does not benefit from it, as long as the decision is seen to be not in public interest, this officer would be seen as guilty of having engaged in a corrupt practice. Let me give an example. Let's say there is a traffic congestion in the city roads, and somebody says that okay, since I come from the southern part of Madras and I live in Besanagar, and therefore we have to cross the Adyar river to get to the other side of the city. Now, let's say if somebody says that let's build another bridge because the traffic on this bridge is already choked up and we need to open up one more bridge. Now, as a civil servant, I may take this decision in the larger public interest, and I genuinely believe this to be in the interest of the public. But let us say that the PWD minister who is going to execute the job has engaged into a collusive arrangement with the contractor, and therefore he takes a cut on the cost of the construction. Later on, let's say another government comes to power and it finds out that there is a corrupt act that was involved in the execution of this contract. Now the civil servant who recommended that there shall be another bridge can also be prosecuted. The only difference he has is that the decision was in public interest. Now that can very easily be countered. Now, if I were a very cantankerous busybody, I can always turn around and say, where was the necessity to build a bridge? You can actually construct a tunnel under the riverbed, and then that would have been a cheaper solution, or that might have been a better alternative. You can come up with 100 other alternatives and therefore say that the original decision was not in public interest. Now, this public interest thing was never really laid down in any great degree of precision, and so it was an absolute potential minefield for a civil servant who wants to take a decision. So what would he do? He would only say that let there be an expert committee appointed to look at what are all the options that may be done, which means that the expert committee will take 1 year or 2 years to take a decision, which means that the bridge which was probably needed right then and there would not get built for 2 more years thereafter. So this particular thing, and the irony is that when it was drafted, and Chidambaram being the clever lawyer that he is, he thought that, look, basically what we really need to do is to ensure that the subaltern class among the administration do not really engage in corruption. So it is these people who would need to be sort of kept in check. As far as the senior bureaucracy was concerned, there was always this provision in the administrative rules of the government that any person above the rank of joint secretary, if there is a corruption prosecution were to be launched, it would need the permission of the government. Now, the government thought that as long as I have the final power to give sanction for prosecution, this particular clause is really not going to hurt any honest officer from discharging his duties. But what happened was, much later, the Supreme Court said that such a clause, that the government's permission is required for launching a prosecution against a senior civil servant, is a discriminatory practice and therefore is opposed to the Constitution, and therefore such a clause is unlawful. Now, so the one protection that was available, that the government would bail out an honest civil servant from any vexatious prosecution, has also been taken out. So today nobody wants to take any decision. The coal mine allotment case is yet another classic example of how a good decision was, eventually become the subject matter of a prosecution. Now, the decision to be taken at that time was whether the coal blocks were to be given to Coal India or should be given away to private parties. Now, this was the decision. Now, the secretary who was in charge of the coal ministry at that time merely said that yes, it need not be given to Coal India because whatever coal blocks that were allotted to it earlier, they have not really shown any great record of bringing those mines into operation, and therefore giving them some more blocks doesn't serve any purpose. Of course, Coal India could not really bring those blocks into production because they couldn't get the environmental clearance. They couldn't get the environmental clearance because the coal was all buried beneath the forest, and opening up those mines would mean destroying the forest, and that was simply no-go as far as the Environment Ministry was concerned. Anyway, that apart. So for this decision, the coal secretary is now one of the accused in the charge sheet filed by the CBI. Now, given this kind of a situation, which civil servant who really has no axe to grind would want to take a decision? So how Mr. Modi is going to bring about a certain administrative rejuvenation is the challenge that he has to tackle, and only if he does that is there going to be any prospect of the investment sentiment improving in the economy, and through that a higher level of output to the economy. So I've just touched on these three important aspects of the challenge that Modi faces. I would now like to conclude with some data that I have picked up from the census statistics, which I think all of you must ponder over, and I'm sure as members of the Rotary Club you will have your own small contribution to making a difference to the situation. And I have this list of 10 items which I thought they're very fascinating examples of what I think are the kind of things that you need to think about. The number of poor people in this country. India is home to some 250 million poor people by the official definition of poverty in this country, which means a person who does not in an urban area have 32 rupees per day, and in a rural area 24 rupees per day. So the number of people who don't have 32 rupees or 24 rupees, as the case may be, is nothing less than 250 million. So this is a number I think that you should keep in mind at all times. Then there is growing income disparity in this country. Now, we probably are not on the scale of some of the Latin American countries or even United States, increasingly is being seen as a extremely unequal society. And but nevertheless, the fact of the matter is that we haven't really made any dent at all in the last 5 to 6 years, for which the data that is available. We continue to be a fairly unequal society, and in as a matter of fact, it is actually worsened in urban areas to a greater degree than in the rural areas. So this is something I think we need to ponder over. The third thing is that we have 250 million people who live below the poverty line, and we have food stocks with the Food Corporation of India that is twice as much as what the buffer stocking requirements are. And the numbers are fairly large. I mean, we're looking at 25 million tons of wheat and rice, which are stored in excess of the buffer stocking requirements of the government. And certain other social indicators, we continue to discriminate against women, with their numbers are now only marginally up from 934 in 2001 census to 947 for 1,000 male. Girl children in the age group of 0 to 6 are slightly better off in the latest census, which 950 girls against 1,000 boys. Infant mortality. Now this is another, in some states like Assam, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, the infant mortality rates are way above the national average, which again itself is not a great performance if you compare it with certain other countries like Sri Lanka. Now, so we do have a lot of ground to catch up on infant mortality rate. Another parameter, women still tend to get married at less than 21 years of age. The average, national average is 20.6. 1 in 5 mothers die at childbirth in states such as Assam, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh and so on. So maternal mortality rate. I was shocked to find that Assam has a maternal mortality rate of 330 deaths per thousand. Every third pregnant woman dies. Only a third of the population have access to treated water supply in this country. Another chastening number. Nearly half the population defecate in the open. I think did make it to the newspapers quite prominently recently. A third of the households still depend on kerosene for their home lighting needs. And another shocking statistic, half the households in this country still depend on firewood for their cooking needs. So these are some of the numbers that I have, I've thought I'll present it to you for you to reflect upon, because it provides a certain context to what we are talking about as economic growth. If economic growth doesn't address any of these numbers, say 10 years from now, 2021 census doesn't show any great numbers, I think I would still think that the 10 years has been a wasted decade as far as the society is concerned. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer.